The ballroom inside the Grand Crescent Hotel was brighter than usual that evening. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen stars, throwing warm golden light across the polished marble floor. Waiters moved carefully between tables covered in white cloth while soft conversations floated through the air. Wealthy guests from different parts of the city had gathered there for one reason only. They were waiting for the arrival of the world-famous concert pianist who had become known for turning every performance into something unforgettable. Near the center of the ballroom stood a large black grand piano. Its polished surface reflected the lights above it like a dark mirror. Several guests had already walked near it to take pictures, but nobody dared touch the keys. The piano almost felt sacred. At the far end of the hall, hotel workers rushed quietly to prepare for the evening event. Some adjusted flowers while others checked the microphones again and again. The manager of the hotel could barely hide his nervousness. Hosting someone this famous was a huge moment for the hotel. Outside the ballroom doors, a black car slowly pulled up near the entrance. The driver stepped out first, opening the back door carefully. A tall figure dressed in a simple dark coat stepped onto the pavement. There were no bodyguards, no loud entrance, and no dramatic behavior. The pianist carried only a small leather bag and looked up at the glowing hotel windows for a few quiet seconds before walking inside. The hotel staff immediately straightened themselves when they recognized the guest. Some whispered excitedly while others stared with wide eyes. They had watched videos of the pianist performing in huge concert halls around the world. Some people called the performances magical because audiences often ended up crying, smiling, or sitting completely speechless afterward. But the pianist did not act like a celebrity. There was a calmness in every movement, a tiredness too. The hotel manager hurried forward with a nervous smile and welcomed the pianist warmly before leading the way toward the ballroom. As they walked through the hallway, soft music from hidden speakers filled the silence between them. "You have no idea how honored we are tonight," the manager said carefully. "People bought tickets weeks ago just to hear you play." The pianist gave a small polite smile. "I'm happy to be here." That was all. Inside the ballroom, conversations suddenly slowed when guests noticed the famous musician entering the room. Heads turned immediately. Some people quietly clapped while others reached for their phones. A few guests even stood up from their tables just to see more clearly. The pianist acknowledged everyone with a gentle nod before walking toward the grand piano. For a moment, the entire ballroom became silent. The pianist rested one hand lightly on the piano lid but did not sit down yet. Instead, those observant enough noticed something strange. The musician looked at the piano almost emotionally, as if it reminded them of something far away. Before the performance officially began, guests continued enjoying drinks and conversation. The pianist remained near the stage area, while several wealthy donors and event sponsors gathered nearby. One man in particular seemed eager to draw attention to himself. He was loud, overly confident, and clearly enjoying the expensive atmosphere around him. He laughed often and spoke as if everyone should automatically agree with whatever he said. "So this is the genius everyone keeps talking about," he joked loudly while sipping his drink. "I watched one of those performances online. Impressive, sure. But honestly, how hard can it be for someone at that level?" A few guests laughed politely. Another person at the table smirked. "Come on. Years of training, talent, discipline. It's obviously difficult." The man shrugged carelessly. "Maybe. But music people always make things sound deeper than they are." Several nearby guests shifted awkwardly, hoping the conversation would end there. Unfortunately, it didn't. The man suddenly walked toward the piano area with his drink still in hand. "I have an idea," he announced loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Why don't we make tonight interesting?" The ballroom slowly quieted again. The pianist looked up calmly. The man grinned. "If you're really that talented, then surely you can create something beautiful from almost nothing." Without asking permission, he reached toward the piano and pressed a single key. One lonely note echoed softly through the ballroom. It wasn't dramatic. It lasted only a moment before disappearing into silence. The man stepped back proudly as if he had done something clever. "There," he said with a laugh. "One note. That's all you get." Some people chuckled nervously while others looked embarrassed by his behavior. A woman at a nearby table whispered, "That's disrespectful." But the pianist did not seem angry. Instead, the musician stared quietly at the piano keys. Then something unexpected happened. The faint smile disappeared from the pianist's face completely. For several long seconds, the ballroom remained silent. Even the man who made the joke slowly stopped smiling because the atmosphere suddenly felt different. The pianist looked down at the exact key that had been pressed. Not annoyed, not insulted, almost shaken. Nobody understood why. Finally, the pianist pulled out the piano bench and sat down slowly. Every small sound in the ballroom seemed louder now. Glasses clinking softly, distant footsteps, the quiet hum of air conditioning. Then the pianist spoke softly for the first time since entering the room. "Interesting choice," came the quiet reply. The guests leaned closer. The loud man crossed his arms confidently. "So, can you actually do something with it?" The pianist rested both hands gently above the keys but did not play yet. Instead, there was silence again, long enough for people to grow uncomfortable. Then one elderly waiter near the back of the room noticed something others didn't. The pianist's hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, from emotion. The pianist took one slow breath and finally pressed the same single note again. The sound floated through the ballroom softly. This time it felt different somehow. The pianist let the note fade naturally before adding another note beside it. Then another. Slowly, carefully, almost like someone speaking through memories instead of words. The room became still. Conversations stopped completely now. Even the hotel workers paused where they stood. The music had barely started, yet something about it immediately pulled people in. The notes were simple at first, almost fragile, but they carried an emotion so heavy that several guests unconsciously lowered their phones without realizing it. The pianist's expression changed while playing. It no longer looked like a public performance. It looked personal, painfully personal. The melody slowly grew richer, flowing gently through the ballroom like a story unfolding piece by piece. No dramatic movements, no flashy techniques meant to impress people. Just honest music filled with feeling. The man who made the joke earlier no longer looked amused. He stared silently at the pianist now. Everyone did. The music somehow made the luxurious ballroom feel smaller, quieter, more human. It no longer mattered who was wealthy or important. In that moment, every person in the room felt connected to whatever emotion was hidden inside the melody. A young waitress standing near the doors suddenly felt tears filling her eyes even though she could not explain why. An older couple at the corner table slowly reached for each other's hands. The pianist continued playing. And with every passing second, it became clear to everyone listening that this was no ordinary performance. Something deeper had awakened the moment that single note was played. Something the pianist had carried silently for many years. And nobody in the ballroom was prepared for where the music was about to lead. The ballroom remained completely silent as the pianist continued playing. Nobody cared about their drinks anymore. Nobody checked their phones. The sound of the piano had taken control of the entire room. The melody grew deeper with every passing second. Soft notes drifted through the air like memories slowly coming back to life. Some parts sounded peaceful, while others carried a quiet sadness that sat heavily in the hearts of everyone listening. The pianist never looked up from the keys. It almost felt like the audience had disappeared completely. The music was no longer for them. It was for someone else. Near the back of the ballroom, the elderly waiter who had noticed the trembling hands earlier leaned against the wall quietly. He had worked at the hotel for over 30 years and had seen hundreds of famous guests pass through those doors. Actors, politicians, singers, wealthy business owners, all kinds of important people. But he had never seen a room change like this before. The music was affecting everyone differently. One woman sitting near the stage slowly wiped tears from her eyes without even realizing it. A young man who had arrived only to impress clients sat frozen in silence, staring at the pianist as if hearing something deeply familiar inside the melody. Even the loud guest who had started the challenge now looked uncomfortable. He loosened his tie slightly and glanced around the room. suddenly aware that his little joke had turned into something far beyond his control. The pianist's fingers moved gently across the keys, never rushing, never trying to show off. There was no need for dramatic movements or impossible speed. Every note felt careful and honest. Then the melody suddenly shifted. A darker emotion entered the music. The change was subtle at first, but everyone felt it immediately. The pianist's expression tightened slightly, as if remembering something painful. And in that moment, far away from the bright ballroom and expensive suits, an old memory returned. Many years earlier, in a small apartment above a crowded street, a young child sat beside an old upright piano with chipped wood and broken paint. The room was tiny. Rainwater sometimes leaked through the ceiling during storms, and the heater rarely worked properly during winter. The piano itself was damaged badly. Several keys no longer made sound. Others stuck when pressed too hard. One pedal barely worked at all. But to the child sitting there every evening, it was the most beautiful thing in the world. The child's parent worked long hours cleaning classrooms and hallways at a nearby music school. Money was always tight. Some nights there was barely enough food for dinner, but somehow the parent always found a way to keep the old piano in the apartment. "You don't need a perfect piano to learn feeling," the parent used to say with a tired smile. The child never forgot those words. Back in the ballroom, the melody became softer again. The audience remained trapped inside the story hidden within the music, even though nobody yet understood what that story truly was. The pianist's hands moved slowly now, almost carefully touching each note like fragile glass. Another memory surfaced. It was late evening in the old apartment. The city outside was noisy with car horns and distant voices, but inside the room everything felt calm. The child sat practicing scales on the broken piano while the parent rested nearby after a long day of work. "You played that one too fast," the parent said gently. The child sighed dramatically. "Nobody notices small mistakes." The parent smiled softly before standing and walking toward the piano. "That's not true," came the quiet reply. "The heart notices." The parent then pressed a single piano key. One note. Simple. Plain. Nothing special. "Music begins here," the parent whispered. "Not with speed. Not with applause. With one honest note." Back in the ballroom, the pianist repeated that same note quietly inside the performance. The elderly waiter's eyes widened slightly as he noticed it. The melody circled around that note again and again, almost like someone returning to an old conversation. Guests listened without breathing. The pianist's face revealed emotion now that could no longer be hidden. Pain, love, regret, gratitude. Everything seemed mixed together inside the music. At one of the center tables, a middle-aged music teacher leaned forward slowly. He had spent decades teaching piano students, and something about the performance felt unusual to him. Not technically unusual, emotionally unusual. "This isn't rehearsed," he whispered quietly to the person beside him. "What do you mean?" The teacher kept watching the pianist carefully. "It feels remembered." The person beside him frowned in confusion, but the teacher could sense it clearly. This performance was not simply art. It was memory turning into sound. The pianist closed their eyes briefly while playing. Another flash of the past returned. The old apartment was colder now. Winter winds rattled the windows softly. The child sat wrapped in a blanket while practicing the same difficult piece again and again. Frustration filled the room. "I can't do it," the child muttered angrily, slamming the piano lid halfway shut. The parent looked up from a pile of work uniforms waiting to be cleaned. "Yes, you can." "No, I can't," the child snapped. "Real pianists have teachers and good pianos and money." The room became quiet. For a moment the parent said nothing. Then slowly, the parent walked over and sat beside the child at the piano bench. "You know what real musicians have?" came the soft question. The child shrugged. "Something painful they survived." The child looked confused. The parent smiled sadly. "That's why music matters. It carries things words cannot." Back in the ballroom, the performance grew more emotional than before. The audience could feel it building toward something bigger even though nobody knew what. One guest quietly lowered his head into his hands. Another reached for a tissue. Nobody seemed embarrassed by their emotions anymore. The pianist continued playing with complete honesty, allowing every memory to flow directly into the melody. The loud guest who started everything now looked almost guilty. He stared at the piano silently, remembering how casually he had pressed that first note only minutes earlier. He had thought this would become entertainment. Instead, it had become confession. At the edge of the ballroom, two hotel workers stood frozen beside a serving cart. "I've never heard music like this," one whispered. The other nodded slowly. "It feels real." That was exactly the difference. The audience had attended many expensive performances before. They had heard technically perfect musicians. They had applauded complicated pieces written by famous composers. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the piano sounded human. The pianist's hands suddenly slowed again, returning once more to the same single note that had started everything. This time, the note lingered longer, and another memory surfaced. The child had awakened late one night after hearing soft piano music coming from the living room. Quietly walking toward the doorway, the child found the parent sitting alone at the old piano in darkness. Only one lamp was turned on. The parent did not notice being watched. For the first time, the child realized something surprising. The parent could play beautifully too. Not professionally, not perfectly, but emotionally. The melody sounded filled with dreams that life had never allowed to happen. Then, after a few moments, the parent stopped playing and stared silently at the piano keys before whispering something barely audible. Maybe in another life. The child never forgot that sentence. Back in the ballroom, the pianist's breathing grew uneven while playing. The emotions connected to the music were becoming impossible to control now. Several audience members exchanged emotional glances. Even without knowing the full story, they understood one thing clearly. This performance was connected to loss, to sacrifice, to love that never disappeared. The melody rose higher now, fuller and more powerful than before, filling every corner of the ballroom. The chandeliers above seemed to glow warmer as the music wrapped around the room like a living thing. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, and deep inside, the pianist already knew something terrifying. That single note had opened a door to memories that had remained locked away for many years. And before the night ended, the truth behind those memories would finally come into the light. The music continued flowing through the ballroom like a living memory that refused to stay buried. Every note carried emotion so deep that the audience no longer felt like they were attending a concert. It felt more like they had accidentally stepped into someone's private past. The pianist remained seated beneath the warm chandelier lights, fingers moving gently across the piano keys with complete focus. Sometimes the melody became soft enough that people leaned forward to hear every detail. Other times it rose suddenly with emotion, filling the entire ballroom with a powerful sadness that nobody could explain. Not a single guest spoke. Even the waiters had stopped moving around the tables. Near the center of the room, the music teacher who had noticed something unusual earlier continued staring at the pianist with growing curiosity. His years of experience told him there was more happening here than simple improvisation. The melody sounded familiar. Not completely familiar, just enough to bother him. He narrowed his eyes slightly as the pianist repeated a certain group of notes again. His fingers slowly tightened around the glass in his hand. "I know this," he whispered under his breath. The guest beside him looked confused. "Know what?" "That melody," the teacher replied quietly. "Or part of it." The guest listened carefully but shook their head. "I've never heard it before." "That's the strange part," the teacher murmured. On stage, the pianist pressed the same single note once again before letting the melody expand around it. The music now sounded fuller than before, almost like different memories speaking to each other. Some guests had started quietly recording on their phones, not wanting to miss a second of what was happening. But most people eventually lowered their devices again because watching through a screen somehow felt wrong. This moment demanded presence. The loud guest who had started the challenge sat silently at his table now. Earlier, he had wanted attention. He had wanted people to laugh. Now he looked deeply uncomfortable. Not because anyone blamed him openly, but because he realized he had accidentally uncovered something deeply personal. Across the ballroom, the hotel manager stood frozen near the entrance doors. He had organized hundreds of events over the years, but he had never seen wealthy guests sitting this quietly for this long. Nobody even touched the expensive desserts being served. The music had become more important than everything else in the room. The pianist suddenly shifted into a softer section of the melody. The notes sounded fragile now, almost uncertain, like someone trying to hold onto a fading memory before it disappeared completely. And once again the past returned. Years earlier, the child sat inside the old apartment beside the damaged upright piano. Rain tapped softly against the windows while distant traffic echoed outside. The room smelled faintly of old books and coffee. The child practiced carefully while the parent cooked a simple dinner nearby. "You missed that note again," the parent said gently without turning around. The child groaned dramatically. "You always notice." The parent smiled softly. "Because I listen." The child stopped playing for a moment and looked toward the small kitchen area. "Why do you care so much about music anyway?" The parent became quiet. For several seconds, only the sound of boiling water filled the room. Then came the answer. "Because music stays," the parent said softly. "People leave. Time leaves. But music stays." Back in the ballroom, the pianist's expression tightened slightly while playing those same emotional patterns. The audience could feel the memories growing heavier. The music teacher leaned closer toward the stage now. His eyes widened slowly as realization began forming in his mind. "No," he whispered. The guest beside him looked concerned. "What is it?" The teacher swallowed carefully before speaking again. "Years ago," he said quietly, "there was a composer nobody talks about anymore. Brilliant, but forgotten. Most of the work was never published." The nearby guest frowned. "What does that have to do with this?" The teacher kept staring at the pianist. "Some of these melodies sound connected to those unfinished pieces." The guest blinked in surprise. "Are you serious?" The teacher nodded slowly. "I studied them once during conservatory training. Hardly anyone remembers them now." The guest looked back toward the pianist with new curiosity. Meanwhile, whispers slowly began spreading between nearby tables. "Did you hear what he said? Unfinished compositions? Maybe this is an old piece of music." "No. It feels too personal for that." The whispers quickly faded again as the pianist shifted into another emotional section. This time the melody sounded warmer, gentler, like a memory of safety. And again the past surfaced. The child sat on the apartment floor beside stacks of old sheet music borrowed from the music school where the parent worked. Many pages were torn or stained with age, but the child treated them like treasure. "You should return those tomorrow," the parent warned while folding laundry nearby. "I know," the child replied absent-mindedly while studying the notes carefully. The parent watched quietly for a moment before smiling. "You love this more than anything, don't you?" The child looked up immediately. "More than everything." The parent's smile became emotional somehow. "That's good," came the soft reply. "Why?" "Because life becomes very difficult without something to love." Back in the ballroom, the pianist's hands moved more confidently now. The melody swelled with emotion, rising higher through the massive room until it almost felt too large for the piano itself. Several guests now openly wiped tears from their eyes. One older man sitting alone near the corner quietly removed his glasses and stared downward, clearly overwhelmed by memories of his own. The performance was no longer just entertainment. The music had somehow forced everyone in the room to remember something personal. A lost dream, a loved one, a regret, a sacrifice. The pianist never spoke, but the audience understood anyway. At one table, two young musicians who had come hoping to network with wealthy sponsors sat completely speechless. "I don't understand how this is happening," one whispered quietly. The other shook their heads slowly. "This doesn't feel practiced." "No. It feels lived." That was the perfect word for it. Every note sounded lived. The music teacher suddenly stood up from his chair. Nearby guests looked toward him in surprise. He slowly walked closer toward the stage without taking his eyes off the pianist. His breathing had become uneven now, as if a memory from long ago had suddenly awakened inside him too. Then the pianist played a short sequence of notes that caused the teacher to freeze completely. His face lost color instantly. "That's impossible," he whispered. The pianist did not notice, or perhaps did not care. The music continued. The teacher remained standing near the front of the ballroom, staring at the moving hands above the piano keys. Finally, another guest quietly asked, "What's wrong?" The teacher swallowed hard. "That melody," he whispered. "I heard it once before nearly 20 years ago." The room nearby grew tense with curiosity. "Where?" The teacher's eyes remained fixed on the pianist. "At a tiny music school downtown. A janitor used to play late at night after everyone went home." Several guests exchanged confused looks. "A janitor?" someone repeated. The teacher nodded slowly. "Nobody knew much about them. But one evening I stayed late practicing and heard music coming from one of the classrooms." He paused carefully. "I never forgot it." The nearby guests stared in shock. "You think the pianist knows that person?" The teacher looked toward the stage again, emotion visible in his eyes now. "No," he said softly. "I think the pianist is connected to them." The whispers spread again, stronger this time. Meanwhile, the pianist finally opened their eyes briefly while continuing to play. For a split second, the musician noticed the teacher standing near the stage. Their hands hesitated slightly, just for a moment, but the teacher noticed, and in that tiny moment of eye contact, something passed silently between them. Recognition. The pianist quickly looked back down at the piano. But it was already too late. The teacher understood now. Not the full story, but enough to realize the performance was tied to someone long forgotten. The music softened again, drifting through the ballroom almost like a goodbye. The pianist's breathing became shakier now. The emotional weight of the memories was becoming harder to hide. Far away in the past, another memory returned. The child had awakened early one morning to find the apartment strangely quiet. The parent sat alone at the piano, staring at the same single note without playing it. "You okay?" the sleepy child asked softly. The parent smiled faintly without turning around. "Just thinking." "About what?" The parent finally pressed the key gently. One lonely note filled the small apartment. Then came the quiet answer. About how one small thing can change an entire life. Back in the ballroom, the pianist repeated that same note again. This time, the audience felt it differently. Not as music, as truth. And slowly, the people listening began realizing that this performance was leading toward something much bigger than anyone had expected when the night first began. The ballroom no longer felt like a luxury event space. It felt like a place where time had slowed down just to listen. The soft sound of the piano filled every corner, moving through the air like something alive and breathing. Even the smallest sound, like a glass being placed down too carefully or a chair shifting slightly, felt too loud now. Nobody wanted to break the moment. The pianist kept playing with steady hands, but something had changed in the expression. The calm focus from earlier now carried a deeper weight, like the music was pulling something from inside that had been hidden for years. The melody no longer felt like a performance for an audience. It felt like a conversation with the past. The guests were still silent, but their silence was different now. Earlier they were curious. Now they were fully connected, almost afraid to move. A few people had tears they didn't even try to hide anymore. Others simply stared, as if afraid that blinking might make them miss something important. The music teacher near the front of the room had not moved at all. His eyes were locked on the pianist's hands, as if trying to solve a puzzle that suddenly became clearer with every note. "This is not random," he whispered again, almost to himself. "There's structure. There's meaning in it." The guest beside him leaned closer. "You're still thinking about that old composer idea?" The teacher shook his head slowly. "It's more than that now." On stage, the pianist shifted into a slightly faster rhythm, but still gentle. The melody rose like a wave, then softened again, repeating this rise and fall like breathing. It felt natural, like it had always existed somewhere and was now just being remembered instead of created. And then, something changed in the music again. A single phrase repeated twice. Then silence between the notes, even though the music continued. The teacher suddenly widened his eyes. He knew that pattern. He had studied it years ago in a forgotten collection of unfinished works from a composer who disappeared from public memory. The piece had never been completed. Only fragments existed. Teachers had shown it to students as an example of lost music. But what was happening now did not feel like fragments anymore. Felt whole. The teacher slowly leaned forward, heart beating faster. "This can't be," he whispered. The pianist continued without hesitation, but the expression had become more intense. The hands moved with growing emotion now, pressing deeper into the keys, as if trying to hold on to something slipping away. The melody became richer again, and again the past returned. A long time ago, the child stood in a quiet hallway outside a music school after hours. The building was almost empty, but soft piano music was coming from inside one of the practice rooms. The sound was imperfect, slightly uneven, but filled with feeling. Curious, the child slowly pushed the door open. Inside, a janitor was sitting at the piano. The same broken upright piano from earlier memories. The janitor didn't notice the child at first, too lost in the music. The notes were simple, but they carried something powerful. Not performance. Not perfection. Something deeper. The child stood silently near the doorway, watching. After a few moments, the janitor stopped playing and finally noticed. "Oh," the janitor said with a small smile. "Didn't see you there." The child didn't answer immediately, still surprised. "You can play like that?" the child asked quietly. The janitor chuckled softly. "Not really. I just play what I feel." That sentence stayed in the child's mind. "Isn't music supposed to be perfect?" the child asked. The janitor shook their head. "Perfect music doesn't stay in people's hearts," came the calm reply. "But honest music does." Back in the ballroom, the pianist played a variation of that same idea. The melody was no longer just emotional, it was becoming powerful in a quiet way. It was no longer about memories alone. It was about understanding them. The audience felt it even if they didn't understand why. The music teacher suddenly stepped forward another step, ignoring the surprised looks from nearby guests. "This section," he said quietly. "This is from the unfinished manuscript." A few people turned toward him. "What manuscript?" someone asked. "The lost one," the teacher replied. "It was never performed publicly. Only a few students ever saw it." The room became even more focused now. The pianist continued playing, but something subtle changed again. The emotion deepened, and for the first time, there was a sense of resolution in the music. Like a story slowly finding its ending. But the teacher's mind was racing now. If this was truly connected to that unfinished work, then how was it being performed like this? Who had taught it? Who had completed it? He looked at the pianist again, studying carefully. And then he noticed something else. The way the pianist paused slightly before certain transitions. Not hesitation. Memory. Like the music was not being invented. It was being recalled. The teacher felt a chill run through him. Meanwhile, the loud guest who had started everything earlier finally leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face with both hands. The confidence he had earlier was completely gone now. He whispered to himself, "I didn't mean for it to turn into this." No one responded. No one needed to. The music had already taken control of the room. The pianist moved into a softer section again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't just memory anymore. Felt like acceptance. The audience slowly felt it too. Something was ending. But not the performance. Something deeper. Another memory surfaced. The child was now slightly older, sitting at the piano alone at night. The parent was not in the room. The apartment felt quieter than usual. There was a folded letter on the table nearby, unopened. The child hesitated before touching it, but never opened it. Instead, The child returned to the piano and played the same simple note again and again, as if trying to hold on to something that had started to fade. In the ballroom, that same note echoed again. Soft, clear, familiar. The music teacher suddenly realized something important. His hands trembled slightly. "This isn't just performance," he said quietly. "This is continuation." A nearby guest frowned. Continuation of what? The teacher did not answer immediately, because he wasn't fully sure yet. But he was starting to understand. The pianist was not only playing music from memory. The pianist was continuing something that had been left unfinished for years. The melody slowly began to rise again, stronger this time. It filled the ballroom with a sense of emotional release, like something heavy slowly being set down after being carried for too long. Some guests closed their eyes. Others leaned forward. Nobody wanted to miss a single second. The pianist's face now showed something more visible than before. Not sadness alone, not joy alone, but something mixed, like letting go, like finally understanding something that had been confusing for a very long time. The music teacher's voice came out almost like a whisper. "That janitor, that must have been connected to the composer somehow." A nearby guest looked at him. "You really think so?" The teacher nodded slowly. "I think the music was passed on." The idea hung in the air. Passed on. Not written. Not taught in a classroom. Passed through people who never became famous. The pianist continued playing, and the melody now felt like it was reaching its final shape. The emotional weight in the room began shifting from confusion to something softer. Understanding. Even the loud guest now sat completely still, watching without a word. The music was no longer shocking them. It was changing them. And in the center of it all, the pianist played on, carrying something far larger than a single performance. Something that had started with one simple note, and was now close to revealing its full truth. The ballroom felt quieter than ever, even though a full crowd was sitting inside it. The music had changed again, but this time it no longer felt like it was searching through memory. Felt like it had found something. There was a strange sense in the air, like everyone was waiting for a truth that had been hidden for too long. The pianist continued playing with deep focus. The hands moved across the keys in a steady flow, but the emotion behind each note had become heavier. It was no longer just about the past. It now felt like something important was about to be revealed. The music teacher near the front had not moved for a long time. His eyes were fixed on the pianist, but now his expression was different. It was no longer confusion. It was recognition mixed with disbelief. "This is impossible," he whispered again, but his voice was weaker this time. The guest beside him leaned closer. "What is it now?" The teacher slowly shook his head. "This section. It connects too clearly." "To what?" The teacher hesitated. Then he spoke carefully. "To something that was never supposed to be finished." At that moment, the melody shifted again. It became softer, almost fragile, like something remembering its own origin. The pianist's face showed more emotion now, and for the first time, there was a slight pause between certain notes, as if each one carried extra weight. And then something unexpected happened. The pianist changed the direction of the melody slightly. Not a mistake. Not improvisation. It was as if a hidden part of the music had been unlocked. The audience noticed it immediately. Even those without musical training could feel the shift. The sound felt different, like a door opening inside the same room. The teacher suddenly stepped forward again, unable to hold back anymore. "No," he whispered. "That variation, that was never written in the public version." A few guests turned toward him. "What do you mean?" someone asked. The teacher swallowed before answering. "There was a composer many years ago," he said slowly. "Someone incredibly talented but never recognized properly. Most of their work was never published. Only fragments remained. Students like me were shown those fragments as examples of lost creativity." The room became more attentive now. The pianist continued playing, but the expression had grown more intense. The teacher pointed slightly toward the stage. "This performance," he said, voice shaking slightly, "it's not just based on that work. It feels like someone has completed it. A silence followed those words. The idea felt too large to accept easily. Completed something that was never finished. The pianist moved into a deeper emotional section, and suddenly, everything felt connected. The melody now carried both sadness and resolution, like something that had been waiting a long time finally reaching its end. And again, the past returned. The child stood in the quiet music school hallway, holding a small bag of books. The janitor who played piano after hours was sitting at the same old instrument again, unaware that anyone was watching. But this time something was different. There was another person in the room, an older man standing near the back, listening carefully. The child had never seen him before. After the music stopped, the older man walked forward slowly. "That piece," the man said quietly. "Where did you learn it?" The janitor looked confused. "I didn't learn it. I just remember it." The older man studied them carefully. "That melody belongs to unfinished work," he said. The janitor looked surprised. "Unfinished?" The man nodded. "It was never published properly. Only fragments survived. But what you just played, it sounded complete." The janitor shook their heads slightly. "I don't know anything about that," they said softly. "I just play what I feel." The older man remained silent for a moment. Then he placed something small on the piano. A torn piece of handwritten sheet music. "I think this belongs to you," he said quietly. Back in the ballroom, the pianist reached a section of the melody that felt almost identical to that memory. The audience felt it too. Something was being connected across time. The music teacher's breathing became uneven. He took a step back slowly. "That's it," he whispered. The guest beside him looked alarmed. "What?" "That fragment," the teacher said. "That exact fragment was part of the lost collection." The guest stared at him. "So what does that mean?" The teacher looked toward the pianist again. "It means someone didn't just remember the music," he said quietly. "They inherited it." The word inherited changed the feeling in the room. People looked at each other in confusion and curiosity. Inherited music? The pianist continued playing, but now the emotion felt even deeper. It was no longer just memory. It felt like carrying something passed down through people who never had the chance to complete it. The melody rose slowly again, and then softened, and then rose again, like breathing through generations. The pianist's expression tightened slightly, and for the first time, the audience could see clear emotion on the musician's face. Not performance emotion, real human emotion. Something personal was happening now. The loud guest from earlier slowly lowered his head. He no longer looked uncomfortable. He looked humbled. "I didn't know it meant this much," he whispered. No one replied. There was nothing to say. The music teacher suddenly realized something else. His eyes widened again, but this time with a different kind of understanding. "If this is truly connected to that unfinished work," he said slowly, "then the original composer's ideas, they didn't disappear." The guest frowned. "What do you mean?" "They lived on," the teacher said, "in someone else's life." The pianist moved into a gentle passage again, almost like a final reflection. The notes were calmer now, more settled, but still filled with emotion. The audience felt it too. Something was nearing completion. The atmosphere in the ballroom had completely changed. Earlier it was curiosity, then shock, then emotional silence. Now it felt like acceptance mixed with deep respect. Even the hotel staff stood still, watching quietly from the sides. No one wanted to interrupt. No one wanted it to end too quickly. Then, unexpectedly, the pianist paused for a brief moment. The silence that followed felt heavy. Not empty, full. The pianist slowly placed both hands gently above the keys without pressing them. The audience held their breath. Then the pianist played a single soft note. The same note from the beginning. But this time it did not feel like a beginning. It felt like a closing. The music teacher closed his eyes for a moment, as if understanding something deeply personal. "When music survives like this," he said quietly, almost to himself, "it means it was never just sound." The guest beside him listened carefully. "It becomes memory," the teacher continued, "and then it becomes something more." The guest asked softly, "What more?" The teacher opened his eyes slowly. "It becomes truth." The pianist continued from that single note, letting it expand gently into the final section of the performance. The melody no longer searched. It no longer struggled. It simply existed, complete and whole. And for the first time since the beginning of the night, the audience felt peace instead of tension. A few guests quietly wiped their eyes. Others simply sat still, unable to move. Even the loud guest remained silent, staring at the piano with a different kind of understanding now, because everyone in that room had realized something important without needing it explained. This was not just a performance. It was a story carried through time. And somewhere inside it, lives had quietly shaped the music long before the audience ever heard a single note. The pianist played on, bringing everything closer to something final, something complete, something that had been waiting many years to finally be heard. The ballroom had fallen into a silence so deep that it almost felt unreal. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the smallest sound, like a soft breath or the rustle of clothing, seemed too large for that moment. The pianist sat at the grand piano, hands resting lightly on the keys, as if holding something fragile that had finally found its place. The music had slowed now, becoming softer with each passing second. It no longer carried confusion or searching emotion. It felt complete. The melody that had begun with a single note had now grown into something full, something that felt like a long journey finally reaching its end. The pianist played the final movement with care, as if afraid that even one wrong touch might break what had been built over the entire night. The audience could feel it too. This was not just the end of a performance. It felt like the closing of a story that had been waiting many years to be told. The music teacher near the front slowly lowered his head. He looked deeply moved, but also thoughtful. His earlier confusion had faded completely. Now there was only understanding in his eyes. "It was never just one piece," he whispered softly. "It was a life inside music." The guest beside him didn't respond immediately. Even speaking felt wrong in that moment. After a few seconds, the guest finally said, "I've never heard anything like this before." The teacher nodded slowly, because it wasn't just played. It was lived. On stage, the pianist continued. The final notes moved gently through the room like fading light at the end of the day. Each sound carried emotion but also peace. There was no struggle left in the music anymore. Only acceptance. And then, for the first time since the performance began, the pianist lifted both hands from the keys. Silence. Complete silence. It lasted several seconds, but it felt much longer. No one clapped immediately. No one moved. It was as if everyone was afraid that sound might destroy what they had just experienced. The pianist sat still, head slightly lowered. The expression on the face was calm, but deeply emotional. There were no dramatic gestures, no attempt to explain anything, just quiet stillness. Then slowly, one person in the audience stood up. A soft clap echoed through the ballroom. Then another, and another. Within moments, the entire room rose to its feet. Applause filled the space, but it was not loud or chaotic. It was respectful, deep, emotional. Many people were clapping through tears, unable to hold back what they were feeling. The pianist finally looked up. For a moment, there was no expression of pride, only quiet reflection, as if still inside the music that had just ended. The music teacher remained standing, but he did not clap at first. He simply watched, as if trying to understand the full meaning of what he had just heard. Then he spoke softly again. "That music," he said, voice steady but emotional, "was never lost. It just waited." The guest beside him turned. Waited for what? The teacher looked at the pianist. For someone who could remember it properly. The applause continued around them, but slowly began to soften as people settled back into their seats. The emotional weight of the performance lingered in the air, refusing to fade quickly. The pianist stood up slowly and turned slightly toward the audience. There was no bow filled with showmanship. Instead, a small, simple nod. A quiet acknowledgement. Then something unexpected happened. A man from the side of the ballroom slowly walked forward. He was elderly, dressed modestly compared to the others, and moved with careful steps. The hotel staff noticed him and looked unsure for a moment, but no one stopped him. He stopped near the stage, looking up at the pianist. The room grew quiet again. The man spoke gently. "I recognized parts of that music," he said softly. The pianist looked at him without speaking. The man continued, "Many years ago, I worked at a small music school. There was a composer whose work was never published properly. Only fragments were left behind. Some students tried to preserve what they could. A few guests began whispering again, remembering the earlier conversations about lost music. The man took a slow breath. I think what you played tonight came from those fragments." The room fell silent once more. The pianist listened carefully, expression unchanged but attentive. The man added, "But it felt more complete than anything we ever had." The music teacher stepped forward again slightly, joining the conversation. "That's exactly what I noticed," he said. "It didn't feel copied. It felt finished." The elderly man nodded slowly. "Then maybe," he said, looking at the pianist, "someone finally gave it an ending." The pianist finally spoke softly for the first time since the performance ended. "It was never about finishing it," came the calm reply. "It was about understanding it." The words were simple, but they carried weight. The room remained quiet as people absorbed them. The elderly man gave a small, respectful nod and stepped back slowly. No more questions were asked. None were needed. The pianist turned slightly away from the audience, looking down at the piano again. One hand touched the edge of the instrument gently, almost like saying goodbye. For a brief moment, the ballroom lights seemed softer, the atmosphere calmer, as if the room itself had exhaled. The music teacher slowly returned to his seat, still thinking deeply. His earlier certainty had grown into something more thoughtful now. "I think I understand it now," he said quietly. The guest beside him looked at him. "What?" The teacher paused before answering. "Music like that doesn't belong to one person," he said. "It passes through people who feel it deeply enough to carry it forward." The guest looked toward the stage again. "So the pianist didn't just play it?" "No," the teacher replied softly. "They carried it." The ballroom slowly began to return to normal movement. Chairs shifted. Soft conversations began again. Glasses were lifted. But the emotional atmosphere did not disappear. It stayed in small pieces across the room, inside every person who had listened. The pianist stepped away from the piano and walked slowly toward the side of the stage. There was no rush, no hurry to leave, just calm movement like someone leaving behind something important but peaceful. As the pianist reached the side of the stage, one of the hotel staff quietly approached. "Everything okay?" the staff member asked gently. The pianist nodded once. "Yes," came the simple answer. A pause. Then the pianist added softly, "It's finally complete." No one in the immediate area fully understood what that meant, but no one asked further. Some things they felt were not meant to be explained in words. The pianist continued walking toward the exit of the ballroom. As the doors opened, a quieter hallway awaited. The contrast between the silent corridor and the emotional room behind felt striking. Before leaving completely, the pianist paused for a moment and looked back once. The grand piano stood under the soft lights, still and quiet now, just an object again, but not forgotten. The pianist turned away and walked forward. Inside the ballroom, people were still discussing what they had experienced, but their voices were calm, almost reflective. No one spoke loudly anymore. The night had changed them in ways they did not fully understand yet. The music teacher remained seated, staring at the piano. "It started with one note," he said softly to himself, "and ended with understanding." The guest beside him nodded slowly. Outside the ballroom, the night air felt different too. Quiet streets, distant city lights, and a soft breeze carried the last traces of the performance into the world beyond the hotel. And somewhere in that silence, the story of a single note that turned into something far greater continued living inside every heart that had been there to hear it.